Hey guys, what is up and welcome to a new League of Legends video. So Kindred has been out for a few days now, and I'm sure most of you are trying to get a feel for this champion and understand really how it works. Well, this video hopefully will help you in that regard. And if it does or you enjoyed the video, don't forget to hit that like button as it helps me quite a bit. I've played several games with Kindred and wrote down a whole bunch of notes that I wanted to share with you guys as sort of a tips and tricks kind of video, while giving you guys a better idea of how I think you should be playing this champion, items, runes, masteries, and all of that good stuff. So we'll start things off by talking about jungle Kindred, then we'll talk about laning Kindred, so mid or bot lane, then general tips and tricks for this champion, and then end it off on some final thoughts on whether or not this champion is overpowered or underpowered or balanced. So let's not waste any more time and go right into the first topic, jungle Kindred. So this is probably going to be the most popular role for Kindred because this champion simply fits this role best, all thanks to the passive and how you have to move around the map in order to, of course, accumulate your passive. Because this passive is very important in her kit, it really just helps her scale overall as a champion into mid and late game, and without good scaling on this passive, you're gonna probably fall off. Also, very quickly, here is the rune and mastery page that you want to use on jungle Kindred. Feel free to change it up as you see fit, but this is probably the general idea. It's a pretty standard attack speed jungle page for the runes and masteries as well. But one of the first and core things that you want to do that's also very simple is just kite around the monsters whenever you're doing the camps, not only to take less damage since you are a ranged champion, but to also constantly be building up your W passive, since the heal will be very beneficial in your clear. Also, whenever you're doing any of the camps, especially things like red buff or blue buff or even the wolves, make sure that your Q is always hitting all three of the monsters and not just two or one. For the skill order, I love starting with W first, then you want to definitely get your Q so that it increases your jungle speed and it of course synergizes with the W very well. Get your E at level 3 and then max your Q first, followed by W, followed by E. And at 2 minutes and 30 seconds, if your passive applies the mark to a scuttle crab, you want to go for that first as soon as possible. Another really useful tip that I found out is you don't want to use your W outside of a camp and then Q into it. Instead, you want to do the vice versa. So let's take a look at an example of what I'm talking about. In the first example, you're going to be seeing me use my W first and then my Q, but you can see that even though my Q still got the reduced cooldown, which is very important, the W is either having to run all the way around to get to the camp and attack it, or it simply can't even get in range. So instead, you want to use your Q first and then your W, because you'll still get the 2-second cooldown reduction while you're within your W. Doesn't change anything regarding that, but your W can always instantly attack the same target. Let's talk a bit about Kindred's passive while you're jungling. So there's several ways you want to approach acquiring a passive that is put on a monster in the enemy jungle. You can either go for it as soon as possible, hoping you'll get there before the enemy jungler does and clears it. You can wait and see and hope that the enemy jungler appears on the other side of the map, which of course will then give you a free several seconds to go ahead and get the passive. Or the other one is just to simply pray that you get the scuttle crab passive mark so that you don't have to overextend into the enemy jungle and put yourself at risk. And in terms of marking enemy champions, again, don't forget that they will see the mark apply on them once you activate it on that champion. So you want to be doing this about maybe 30 seconds in advance of when you're about to gank that champion. And don't forget, it takes 8 seconds for the mark to settle in when you use it on said champion instead of being absolutely instant, so keep that in mind. And the final things I'll talk about for jungle Kindred are the items. So you almost always want to go warrior over devour because warrior just simply gives you much better stats for Kindred. Warrior gives you that very useful armor penetration stat, which is healthy on Kindred since she doesn't really have the best scaling on her abilities in terms of AD. And warrior also lets you be usually stronger in the mid game, which is where I believe her true power spike lies. And on top of that, Devourer also did get nerfed for ranged champions as it requires 4 auto attacks now instead of 2. And finally, for actual items, you want to probably get something like a Bork, Youmuu's, Runans, and Last Whisper. These ones worked for me quite well. So that is about all the tips and tricks I currently have for jungle Kindred specifically. But let us next jump into laning Kindred. So once again, first off, talking about what runes and masteries you probably want to use whenever you're playing laning Kindred. Feel free to change it up as you see fit. So one of the first things I noticed is that her ultimate is very good as an anti-tower dive ability. So if the enemy team decides to try and tower dive you, well, you pop this ultimate and chances are you'll kill them before they kill you since the tower is also attacking them, assuming you're lucky enough. However, one of the best things about laning Kindred that I personally really enjoy is that her W is pretty much free lane harass. There's nothing the opponent can do about your W other than of course get out of range, but then that usually means they'll be missing CS. So all you gotta do is go into the middle of the creep wave, auto attack the opponent once after throwing out your W, and just watch the W harass them down and make them run out of range and then missing CS. But to even go on top of this, you can have your W harass the opponent while they're trying to CS under tower, since as long as you're at the tip of the W, you're most likely out of range of tower, while the W is free auto attacking them and there's nothing they can do. So in terms of abilities, I do the exact same thing as jungle Kindred thanks to the W being so useful even at level 1. And in terms of items, there's 2 builds that you can go. If you're playing mid Kindred and you want to play her in an assassin type style, you want to go for the Z type build, so Blade of the Rune King, Youmuu's, Last Whisper, and then something like a Runaan's and or BT. However, if you want to take more of the ADC type approach and you're playing mid lane or just simply playing bot lane as an actual ADC, you want to go something like maybe a Blade of the Rune King, Shiv, IE, BT, and Last Whisper, something along the lines of that. The biggest issue I did find, however, with playing laning Kindred is that getting the monster marks for your passive is very difficult. If you're lucky enough and it marks Scuttle Crab, it isn't that bad. However, if it's somewhere deep within the enemy jungle, well, it's going to be very obvious when you leave lane and go for the mark. And I've had a lot of times where the mid laner and the jungler would go to that camp as they see me leave lane and most likely kill me. So you might need some sort of synergy with your own jungler in order to make this work out in your favor. And you usually almost always want to mark the laner that you're facing unless you have teleport, which you usually should in the mid lane as well, which then you can mark someone on the opposite side of the map like top lane or bottom lane, and then teleport down to assist your team in a kill and then proc your mark. But next, let's talk about tips and tricks on Kindred as a champion in general without focusing specifically on a lane. So if you have 2 Kindreds in a normal game, the mark on the minimap in terms of color is based on whichever team you're on. So if your team color is blue, your mark will be blue. If your team color is red, well, your mark will probably be red. Here's one that I really want to talk about, Trinity Force. This is listed as a recommended item by Riot. Now I personally think that this item is somewhat of a bait. The reason for that is the fact that Sheen is a very poor item on Kindred, having absolutely nothing to do with AP. But more importantly, she has very low base AD, and of course Sheen does work off of your base AD by multiplying it by 200%. Trinity Force also doesn't really offer that much attack speed, and it doesn't offer you any armor penetration, 2 of which I believe are the most important stats on Kindred. Since this champion does really rely on her auto attack, so you want the attack speed, and armor pen because you want to use that percent damage even better. And if you were to look at the AD scaling on her abilities, well, you're gonna see that it's not very high. Then you have the CDR stat, which I believe to be so-so. It's not horrible, but it's not necessarily amazing, and the reason for that is because your Q, probably being your most primary type ability, is an ability that you'll synergize with your W almost all the time. But the interesting thing is that when your Q is synergized with your W, the cooldown is brought to 2 seconds, but that's a static cooldown, meaning it's unaffected by CDR. But even with that being said, having lower cooldown on the rest of your abilities could still be very useful. So it's not a stat that you really absolutely need, but it's still nice to have. She's also somewhat of a snowbally champion from my experience. A very weak early phase, maybe the first 5 or so levels, but she scales really hard into mid game as long as you're keeping up with your passives. And her late game is arguably not super strong just because of her poor AD scaling on her abilities, but luckily for her in the late game, she will have percent damage from her passive, her E, and even the Blade of the Rune King. Now moving on to part 2 of the general tips and tricks. A very interesting thing is that even though your passive stops marking monsters in the jungle once you reach 6 stacks, you can actually cheat this system by a little bit. So once you're at 5 stacks and the monster has been applied a passive somewhere in the jungle, you can first go ahead and get your 6th stack on an enemy champion and then go for the jungle monster and make it the 7th. Let's talk a bit more about the passive and how you really want to utilize it. So naturally, whenever you activate it on a champion, they will probably start playing a lot more safe while the passive mark is on them, at least for the first 30 seconds or so. So you can actually use this against them in the sense that you can mark someone that you're not planning on ganking, but if your top laner is having a tough time against the enemy top laner, you can mark that enemy top laner, make them play passively for the next 30 seconds to a minute, which will give your top laner some breathing room. And there's just several ways you can utilize the passive in this sense that will just simply play with the minds of the enemy opponents, which I think is to be one of the coolest things you can do. Also, one of the strongest aspects of Kindred is the fact that this champion absolutely destroys Poise, Baron, and Dragon. You have your passive giving your auto attacks percent damage of the current HP, you have the Blade of the Rune King percent damage, and you have your E percent damage. Put it all together and you have disgusting damage against these monsters. In the final part 3 of the general tips and tricks, make sure that you auto, Q, then auto again for a quick succession of damage utilizing every single second that matters. And moving into the ultimate, which I'm sure a lot of people are trying to understand, really how do you want to use this thing? Well, you can either use it to make a losing fight even and then see who can last hit better, which then you can also utilize your E and your Q ability to deal that final last second blow as the ultimate runs out. The ultimate is also very strong when it comes to finishing moves like maybe a Jinx Rocket, a Riven ultimate, and things like that, or if you're getting poked down really hard, maybe like a Ziggs ultimate. And a really cool thing you can do that I recently found out is you can combine your Q, W, and ultimate to get into the Dragon or Baron pit, maybe steal it or put on some damage. Your ultimate will prevent you from dying, and your W with your 2-second cooldown Q makes you able to jump right back out of the pit instantly. I think this is a really smart way to utilize all of her abilities together. Now for the final thoughts on this champion. Is she overpowered? Is she underpowered? Is she balanced? I think she's balanced. Yes, this champion can be very strong and deal an absurd amount of damage, but it does require you to get somewhat lucky and not have to be counter jungled. A very strong mid game, has a lot of uses with her ultimate, and just feels very smooth of a champion to play. But if you face a good jungler who counter jungles you and takes all of your passive marks, it's going to be a little difficult to scale into the game. A very squishy jungle champion that doesn't have the best of escapes. I mean, yeah, the Q is really good, but it doesn't cover a lot of distance fast, compared to maybe something like a Kha'Zix. And you need to utilize her abilities in a very precise way to make the full use of them. But other than that, I have to say a very balanced champion. If she gets ahead, yeah, she's going to be very strong, but it can be difficult to get ahead if the enemy jungler knows what they're doing. But that is it for this video, guys. A very information-packed video. If you did enjoy it or found it informative or useful, please hit that like button. It helps me quite a lot. Share it with your friends as well. Subscribe if you haven't, and then check out my other videos. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Peace.